Hi. So we're here to talk about how things are changing. And yeah, so we've been talking about this shift of paradigm, right? And what it means to be in a world that is always changing. So to first start talking, I would like to bring some ideas around what is this thing that we call a paradigm and how can we define it before we talk about how we can change it or shift it. So you will see many different ways to approach this thing of a paradigm. In science, you will see people talking about scientific paradigm shift, which is represented by what people are calling the Anthropocene epoch, which is characterized by the effects of humanity in the Earth ecosystems. But you also see this paradigm being talked about in other different ways depending on the context. So some people who define themselves as techno-economists, they will be talking about it as a paradigm in the economy given all of the digital means that we have nowadays. And then you see them talking about the rise of the economy of the information and knowledge. But also you can find many archetypes, and I kind of like them because they also represent other views to talk about the shift of things that we are experiencing. And you will see the exoteric world talking about some interesting terms as well. And then you'll find things like the transition to the age of Aquarius, or even the fall of Babylon. And these are all things that represent this idea that things are changing. But I think that no matter what, we can reach a consensus that, well, we are in a phase of transition. And this phase is characterized by many different things happen at the same time. And we can try to do our best to understand how this is all happening and how we can behave in this change so as to adapt individually and collectively. And here I'm going to share some of my own experience in this journey as well, which is a personal journey to understand what's going on and also to find adaptable paths to my own life. And well, this is what the talk is going to be about. But before we go into that, I think it's nice to give some more context into this change. And I've been reading a lot lately about this moment, and I've found some interesting people talking about it. And I would like to share what I think is one of the best representations, in my opinion, of this moment we're living in. So we have this gentleman called Daniel Schmattenberg. He is one of a type. I'm not going to give his bio because that would be a TEDx itself. But he talks about the moment we're living in. And although there's a lot of text now, I can summarize it. And what he's basically saying is that we live in a moment where all of the positive exponential curves are true. So he mentioned Kurzweil, which is a futurist, and he talks about the positive exponential curves we are seeing. And that means all of the advances in biotech, all of the advances in health, all of the advances in the economy itself, they are all true. I mean, this is the moment of human history where we have the most technology, the most development. This is true. But he also mentions that, well, the negative exponential curves, they are also true. So this is also a moment we're living in where you have the most threat to diversity, the most threat to ecosystems, and also the most threat to civilization itself, which I think is something we don't often realize. So given all that, what he says is that, well, people choose whichever curve they want to fit their database. And this is what we see often when we go to talks, depending on where you go and depending on what is the view of the person giving the talk, right? So given all that, what does he say? He says, well, if you look at this, all of these exponential curves, both positive and negative, what do you have? Oh, let me change this. Yeah. So what you have is that, and then he says, if shit's getting better and worse at the same time, actually what you have is a phenomenon known in physics as phase stabilization, which means that we are in a transition. If we think about it, if we think about our world as a dynamic system, it's truly a transition. And what does that mean? It means that we are in a liminal phase of change, and we have to decide where we're going. we can either make emerge new ways to organize our economy, our political systems, our personal lives, or we're gonna drop down to a lower order of organization, which is chaos. And we've seen this in many places of the world already. So he talks about this idea of emergence, which is something that I find fascinating, and I'm gonna talk a bit more about it later on. But yeah, so here's what he says. So you can either find ways to organize, and then you find higher orders, higher degrees of order through this process of emergence, or you have an entropic drop down into chaos. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about what is this thing of emergence, and my goal for this talk is that by the end of it, we have a good picture of what this guy is talking about. So to start off, to find answers, I think we need to start off by having questions, and that's what we have here. So what is this moment of change we're living through, and what is changing? Why is it changing, and how is all that changing? So I like to look at different areas of expertise to think about that, and one that I find really interesting is physics. And then there we're going to see that change is law. That's the first law of thermodynamics. And although this might be very detached from our world, it is not. We are just atoms floating around, if you think about it, which means we are energy. So things are just changing, and they change at different scales. But it might be that our perception of the world, both individually and collectively, tells us that things are changing, but these changes are accelerating. So if you think about what the world used to be any century ago, it was completely different from what we have now, because we're now in a moment of high connectivity, which means that the world has transformed itself, and it will continue to. And this is my hypothesis for why this is happening. We are increasingly connecting. That is through the internet, which is crazy if you think about it. We take it for granted, but it's crazy. And then more and more things are getting interconnected in our world. Our economies, our political systems, our social lives, which are lives of themselves, and everything else if you think about it. So my hypothesis for all this moment of change is that because things are becoming more connected, and they will become even more, things will keep changing, because these connections, they give rise to change, because you have more information flowing around, you have causality that is non-linear. So it's not that you have more event A causing event B, you actually have loops of causality, and they will just keep coming at us. And it is actually quite important that we understand all this, so we know our place in all this mess, and we don't find ourselves lost. And given all that, and this moment that we're living through, I'd like to talk a little bit about my own shifting of paradigms, because the moment I realized all these things, or the moment I started to sense them and feel them, I stopped to think that, well, I am not in a path that will give me the abilities to adapt to all this. If we think ahead 10, 20 years from now, things are going to be very different, and how can I be in a good place in that moment? And then my own paradigm shifts started to happen. And they happened in many ways all at once, which was quite intense, but I'm glad they happened, because from that moment on, and I'm talking about 7 months ago, I changed my education, I changed the way I deal with relationships, I changed the activities I do, and what my goals in life are, because I realized that, well, I need to adapt to all this. And then I'm going to share a little bit of what all these changes have been in each of these areas. So if we start by education, my changes were at one level very drastic, because I dropped out of a university which used to be my dream school. So I was going to a university where every 4 months I would move to a different country. It was an online university, so for 2 years I lived in 7 different countries. But then I realized that it was just not preparing me to the world I was foreseeing, because it was still a university with areas of expertise that did not talk to each other. I mean, they were not connecting things, but we live in a world that is connected. We need this sort of thinking. And then I got in touch with these ideas, which are things that I've been exploring in many different ways as a way to educate myself about the moment we're living through. So the idea of systems thinking comes from the premise that we can look at things focusing on the whole and not on the units. So if you think about science, because of the Newtonian paradigm, I mean, Newton is great. He gave us a lot of things, but also he gives a way of thinking that was not so well adapted to the moment we're living in, which is this reductionist approach to things. You isolate things, you go to the subunits of things, and you try to understand those subunits, and then you extrapolate that to understand the whole. This idea is exactly the opposite. It goes and looks to the whole, is a holistic approach, and then it tries to make sense of things. And then from that on, I went to complexity, which is, okay, so if you look at all things, if you look at things from the perspective of the whole, then how do you look at things in the perspective of the whole that are interconnected? And these we call complex systems, which are systems that are interconnected. And then that's a whole new world, which I think is very relevant to understand this word of connectivity. And then I also started looking at technologies and ways for people to self-organize into peer-to-peer fashion. Because if you think about things, how things generally function in the world, what you have is that all of our interactions are dictated by intermediaries. And we hardly ever do things just in a peer-to-peer fashion. So I started looking at that as well. Another change that happened to me was in the way I face relationships. So relationships to others and to myself. I'm afraid it's going to change. Hopefully not. Yeah, it did. So relationships to others and to myself, in the sense that I've become more aware of how I relate to people. Because, again, and when you are in an interconnected world and you start thinking about the world that way, you understand that all connections you have, all relationships you have, they matter because they feed back and they come back at you. And this is something quite interesting to notice. But I also have changed my relationship to myself. I had an experience in Seoul where I did an intensive meditation training for 2 months, and that has been amazing to understand all of the changes happening within and without. So this whole idea of self-awareness, which I think is very relevant to the moment we're living in. And then my activities also changed, in the sense that I wasn't studying because people told me I should, or I wasn't working because, well, I needed a job. I was actually doing things that first were voluntary, in the sense that I chose to do them, which doesn't mean it's not paid. I was doing things that I found purposeful, which means that, well, I was there working, or I was there putting my time into something, but it didn't feel like a burden. It was just something that was giving me something back greater than actually what I was giving to it. And I started to look at things as journeys of learning, journeys of growing. And this has also been something paramount to all these things that have been happening in my life. And as I said, I also changed my goals. And now I don't strive to be rich anymore, which, I mean, was one of the ideas at some point. I strive to find patterns of collective organization that will make us resilient to face all these changes that are coming at us, and patterns of adaptation coming from evolution theory that will make us adapt to all these changes. And I also have had this goal of learning no matter what I do, even with mistakes. I think that's where you learn more. And well, just to sum it up, to say things from here, from where I am now after this journey of 7 months, there is ways, like we can make it through all these changes. And you can think of all these changes: climate change, the refugee crisis, economy crisis, political crisis. All these are changes that we can go through and we can collectively strive. These are not things that are impossible to deal with. And the only thing we need to realize is first that we are living through this moment of change, and then you can look at it from many different points of view. I like the academic point, and then complex systems is giving me the framework to think about it. But also, if you just think about your relationships, and if you just think about how your world works, you can do a lot yourself there that does have a big impact in the whole. And with that, I would like to bring the idea here of, again, what Daniel said of emergence, which is the idea of when you look at a complex system, and you can think of a complex system as being a social system, which is just people interconnected, right, with the relationships and all, you can behave in certain ways using the small-scale interactions of these people to make emerge something greater than the sum of all of the parts. And that's exactly what he's touching at here when he says that we need to find ways to organize ourselves so as to adapt to all these changes at greater levels of organization. And how does that work? Well, it's up to us to find out. But there are many different things we can think of. And one of these things is the way we deal with things. Today we live in a society where you have win-lose relationships, where your success means my defeat, and vice versa. So I think the big shift in paradigms is how we go from here to here, where the relationships are win-win, where your success is my success. And since the time is almost done, I would just like to bring here a definition, a more formal definition of what this process would look like. It's the process of emergence. And you have it as a process by which a system of interacting subunits acquire qualitative new properties that cannot be understood as a simple addition of their individual contributions. And here you have a visual representation of this phenomenon. And this is not, of course, a social phenomenon. These are not humans, but you can have an idea of what it looks like, where the flock of the birds, it's a higher level of organization. It's a superorganism. It's something that is fundamentally different than any of the properties of the birds themselves, but it's just made of the interactions of the birds. It's just, it's imprinted in the local interactions of these birds, and then you have the emergence of this beautiful thing. So yeah, if I could have the chance, I would just use this moment to get you to all think about what could emerge if we change our little interactions, our daily interactions with each other. Politically, economically, socially, as family, all these things, what can we do together that will make emerge something greater than all of the dreams we can think individually. So that's about my time. Thank you.